This time on Poll Hub, competitor, friend, enemy, frenemy? What is China to America now? That's a question we're looking at today. Then we talk a lot about trust in institutions, and we have for a long time. Pollsters love that question because it says a lot about a country. But this time we're looking at how much we trust each other, and there's some surprising findings here. Finally, we get to 1939 to find out what Americans thought about iced tea back then. Why? It's iced tea season, come on. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. Mary Griffith.
I'm AJ Gambino.
Cassidy Connors.
I'm Lee Merrick.
So China has been a country since Nixon opened China, right, back in the 70s. A interesting, huge country that has had a changing relationship with America. And especially over the last couple of decades, there's been this, is it a competitor? Is it an enemy? A frenemy, like we said in the open. But what has happened over the last few years is especially interesting because China has kind of finally come to the point where economically and potentially in terms of foreign power is essentially are equal. Not exactly. I know there's some economists who will say, well, there's some numbers that suggest they're not. There are other economists who say that China might be ahead of us. But at this point, America and China, I think for much of the world, are kind of on the same platform, which has not been the case. So at this somewhat of a milestone, how do we view China? Most Americans view China as an unfriendly nation with an authoritarian government and an express pretty broad concern in polling about Chinese ownership of things here in the U.S., like technology, supply chains, farmland. That's been a big deal. At the same time, in polling, many Americans believe that trade with China benefits the U.S. economy. All you got to do is look at your latest Amazon order to see how much is coming from China. And most Americans don't favor dramatically increasing this kind of distance between the two countries. So a very complex thing. Let's talk about a couple of pieces of data, and then we'll get to it. Last month, or 2 months ago now, it's July, in May of 2026, YouGov did a survey asking about this. 52% of Americans say what happens in China affects the U.S. a lot. So a majority say a lot, 38% say a little. So the vast majority of Americans think that what happens in China does affect us here somewhat. 54% describe China as unfriendly or an enemy. 22% say it's an ally or a friendly nation. So there's a pretty big, it's not a big majority, but it's a big gap between those who view China as not our friend and those who view it as our friend. And then 57% describe China's government as authoritarian. Only 3% call it democratic, and 15% it is a mix of both. Lee, I kind of want to start with you because I alluded to the opening of China. The relationship with China and the U.S., although it goes back obviously centuries before that, I think in the modern era is all about that opening from, that midpoint in 1970s to now. And I'm just curious whether you think this discussion about frenemy, enemy, friend, or ally, is this really substantially different than the conversation we've been having for, 55 years? Or is it different because China is a different country?
I think a little bit of both. I think there was a time before the opening of China and U.S. relations, before the 70s. I mean, the view was what happens in China stays in China. I mean, there was this great wall, literally and figuratively, but the notion that this was sort of over there, nothing was to be trusted. But there was a sense that maybe there could be some economic gain. I think what's happened in the ensuing 60 years or so is that the economic interdependence has become much more pronounced. That's opened up reluctantly, though. There's been more of an opening of the political lines, certainly in the communication area. But as you say in the numbers, the trust isn't there. And that seems to have carried over from the old days more than the economic side of the equation.
Yeah, that's a big piece of the data. And Barb, I think that's really interesting that one of the biggest concerns from Americans is what China is buying in the U.S. So 62% of Americans in a TIPP poll from last month oppose Chinese companies owning U.S. farmland, we mentioned that, or critical infrastructure. And there's a pretty good partisan mix here. So 57% of Democrats think that, 70% of Republicans. 65% say the U.S. depends too much on China for manufacturing and supply chains. 74% are concerned that Chinese-owned technology companies could be collecting Americans' personal data. That's the TikTok thing. And while there's bipartisan agreement on reducing China's influence over U.S. land, technology, all these things, there is less consensus among Americans over whether the U.S. military defend Taiwan. 44% support defending Taiwan, 31% oppose, and 25% are unsure. I'm interested because AI, which is this is where the world is going. AI has been a place where China and the U.S. have, to a large extent, unlike prior technologies, we're basically on the same page right now. Do you think that this concern among Americans about Chinese buying things in the U.S. is maybe a little behind where we are in terms of the discussion about technology in China versus the U.S.?
Well, the relationship between the U.S. and China is so complicated. When we look at these questions, we're asking people to kind of parse different issues that have come up in debate in the kind of the public realm. But one of the things I found very fascinating is the age difference in people's perceptions of China. And that's very real, because if you are older, you know a very different China than if you are younger. We have had a very different relationship with China for those folks who are, under 45 years of age than we did for those who are over 45 years of age. And recognize that it becomes more complicated because it is a mix of politics and economics. And it's really hard to kind of pull those two strings apart, especially since, we have a capitalist economy, one where, we value market forces, where we value individualism, where we value competition. And so although China has certainly benefited from the values that we have on the economic side and have even allowed investment there, it's a very different economic structure. It is a communist country. One of the reasons that Nixon opened up China was because of the Cold War against Russia. And they wanted Russia and China were competitors. They were political competitors. They were enemies. And so by opening up the doors of, the U.S. to China and China to the U.S., we were trying to, minimize and capitalize the relationship between the animosity between China and Russia. So there were a lot of political factors that came into play. What's transpired over the last 50 years, though, is a China that has become an economic engine. By opening up those doors, it allowed U.S. companies to benefit from, regulations of a different sort. In other words, rather than market forces, they were government forces, which allowed companies to create and to develop and to produce products at a much cheaper way than they could in the States, particularly after a lot of the labor union movements. So it is very complex. Sometimes it's really hard to differentiate between the politics and the economics. I think the concern about China controlling a lot of the U.S. infrastructure, controlling agriculture, having such a large imprint on social media, is that we can't differentiate between what is economic and what is political. And we have a very different political system, one being a democracy, another being authoritarian communist structure. So the concerns are real, and, polls can give you a sense of public perceptions and comfort level. I think we have, an administration that has been giving us kind of conflicting messages. On the one hand, they're an enemy politically, but then on the other hand, maybe there's some benefit economically. And so I think that has caused some confusion as well. But when you talk about AI, is kind of the next big economic driver, or is at least perceived as the next big economic driver, and whomever controls that is going to control not only the economics of global, of countries globally, but likely the politics as well.
You mentioned the age difference, and I just wanted to bring up something from the YouGov poll back in May. There is a huge generational difference about the way that people perceive China. And I think, Lee, you get at it because of the history, but among adults 18 to 29, 39% describe China as unfriendly or an enemy. That's compared with 68% of those 65 and older. Younger adults in general are more likely to view China favorably. 30% say they see China as an ally or a friendly nation. Remember, that's 39% enemy. That's 30% ally or friendly nation among 18 to 29. And that's just 13% of people over 65 think they're friendly. So we have a young person here. AJ, what do you think about China?
I don't know if I would say I have a strong opinion on China, but I will say there is a big online trend towards viewing China more favorably than people have in the past. And I think that reflects a couple of things. Firstly, a general less positive view of the American government that people my age have. And then also, it kind of coincides with a lot of other trends like health and wellness and different aesthetics. A lot of young people look towards China really favorably in those areas. And I think that kind of has helped their perception among younger generations.
Is that part of it, you think, that you didn't grow up steeped in big, bad Maoist China going to destroy the world? You grew up with China's where they make all the stuff that we buy on Amazon, and China's the people who created TikTok. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think a lack of direct conflict with China has definitely helped their perception among younger people for sure.
Well, I think you make a really good point. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the cultural interest in China, because there is also kind of this move of incorporating a lot of the aesthetics, a lot of the health and wellness approaches from China, among other things. And so maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is rooted in social media. I mean, you look at TikTok, I feel like there was a large negative reception to when it was shut down temporarily. I mean, you saw a lot of Americans sort of rebelling against that, and even some people joining Red Note, which is primarily Chinese social media, for a little bit before TikTok got reinstated. So I think that contributes a lot to it. And then just a general frustration with a lot of aspects of American culture amongst younger people makes them look for alternative ways of doing things like, Chinese culture.
So I think, the bottom line here is that there is a sense of interdependence, but not necessarily in all spheres, economic and political.
Well, whether or not you trust China may be indicative of a larger deficit that Americans are facing, and that's a deficit of trust. And while we've talked a great deal on this podcast about a lack of trust in institutions, what about trust in one another and why that actually may really matter? So let's dive in. According to Pew Research, in May of 2025, the proportion of Americans who say that most people can be trusted has dropped precipitously from 1972. At that time, 46% of residents nationally said that most people can actually be trusted. That compares with 34% in 2018. And fewer than half of Americans, 44%, say that they trust all or most of the people in their neighborhood, down from 52% a decade prior. And about a quarter of Americans say they know most or all of their neighbors, a slight decline from 3 in 10 back in 2018. So, Barb, I want to open this up to you from right off from the bat. Why do you think that there is this drop in trust among Americans?
Wow, that is certainly a big question. And some of the data over time has certainly been speaking to that. I'm thinking of the first surprise of bowling alone, where we realized that we were become a much more mobile society, and that we had, with all our lives and busyness and in many, many directions between, both adults in a household working and kids going into different directions, we realized we were no longer really speaking to each other. And I don't know whether, it's one of those, is it the chicken or the egg? But we have seen a decline in institutions overall, which we have talked about. And this is certainly, resonated onto a personal level. And I don't think it's just about the politics, where we see ourselves very polarized. But as you point out, I mean, there are, most Americans don't know their neighbors and haven't connected with them. And the places that we used to connect with them, certainly many of them don't exist. And those that do exist have certainly declined in participation. And I'm thinking mostly of community centers, clubs and groups that you had something in common with. Ironically, we're actually able to connect with people on very niche levels, but we're doing that on social media, not in person. So we may be talking to people who, we have similar interests in or similar hobbies, but they're not necessarily in our neighborhood. So we're not meeting up with them except virtually. And so I think that lack of, one-on-one kind of interaction, I know that, our students always crave that. If given a choice between, having a speaker or an event or something, on Zoom, they much more prefer that we be able to do things in person, work in person, party in person. Anything you can think of, really to have that kind of personal connection. So I think it's been something that has been evolving. It's been exacerbated, I think, by the decline in institutions overall and just our capacity to be able to connect with people on a one-on-one basis or just in reality as opposed to virtually.
Just to your point, and I know, Mary, you got more in your mind, but I just wanted to say one other thing here, and that is I'm struck as we've changed the physical structure, even of where the Marist Pole is, where people were mostly on telephones and not necessarily interacting. Now we have a much more interactive workspace for the large number of students who are involved in the Marist Institute for Public Opinion. And what I'm struck by is how many of them comment about, this is really nice because I'm interacting with a lot of people, I'm working in groups, and they kind of crave that. And I'm always struck by that because that's sort of the way I view things. It's like more in person is always better. But they're really, underscoring that in their reaction just to the way their work habits are and how they can interact with people.
And I know in the past, in some of our conversations, you jokingly say, you rely on people who might bring you a cup of soup when you're sick. And the data actually may be a little bit surprising here. And I do want to bring up a point about whether or not this is trust versus just overall friendliness and community building here. But according to that Pew study, they found that 82% of Americans who say that they are highly trusting, they're high trust Americans, that they would bring in the mail or water plants for a neighbor, versus 67% of low trust Americans. 78% of those so-called high trust Americans say they would conserve water or electricity if public officials asked, versus 64% of low trust Americans. And here too, high trust Americans are more likely to bring a meal to a sick neighbor, loan money to a friend in an emergency, and give a spare key to a neighbor. Now, there's a lot going on here in this data because I think that there are many different levels of responsibility and trust, but is this really a question or a matter of trust, Lee, or is this something more, this idea perhaps that Barb hit upon, which is we're more isolated? Or is it just this sense of being trusted versus trusting others?
Yeah, I think there's a greater sense of isolation, but also the population has changed. We're so much more mobile. Kids go away to college. They may not come back home. That's going to affect long-term concepts of neighborhood, which were very prevalent in earlier generations. And that's when the trust was higher because there was more of a social fabric connecting people. So I think that there's a lot of that going on just in our lifestyle. And if you put in an overlay of our political polarization and our technological modes of communicating and how fragmented that has become, trust is going to take a hit on that.
I do want to bring in one of our student producers, Cassidy Connors, to talk a little bit about this, because you had an interesting reaction, Cass, when I mentioned the topic of this segment. What do you think about this decline in trust, and do you think that there is some hope or optimism for the future?
I agree with the decline. If I'm on the street, I'm not trusting anyone around me, especially as a woman of my age. It's just terrifying. You feel like everyone is not safe. I think there could be hope, but honestly, it would be more for the government to put laws in place to keep us safe in our environment, because there's so many things that happen where there's not enough security or you don't have trust. But I agree, but I think it also depends on the type of person you are. Like, I view myself as a pretty anxious person, so I wouldn't necessarily, as like a normal mind person, be as anxious as I am. But it all factors into like the year, my age. But it would probably be different for like a 50-year-old man walking around.
Well, Pew Research did delve into a little bit of the factors and identified some kind of overlapping forces that seem to be related and not necessarily causative, as we always like to say. We're looking for relationships in the social sciences, no pun intended there. But, they point to, what we've already mentioned, the political polarization, that people feel that Republicans and Democrats are just so far apart that they don't have a similar worldview, which certainly, does cause distrust. The other thing they mention is that fewer Americans share a common, media diet. There were points not too many decades ago where we at least did tune in to certain events or to certain news media. And that certainly has fragmented, over time. So we don't necessarily have this common understanding of what is going on and what is important. And of course, we all spend a lot more time alone and less time socializing because of technology. I can't tell you the number of times I've even been in a restaurant and seen people at a shared table all on their individual cell phones rather than, talking to each other. And so even those times where we have an opportunity to communicate and talk about things that we may have in common, everybody's heads down into that little screen that we keep in our pocket.
Well, I do want to leave off, before we head into the fun fact, Lee, on a very positive note here, that the data does suggest that the long decline in trust has abated somewhat since 2018. Levels have been flat or slightly up in more recent years. And between 2020 and 2025, slightly more Americans said they gained trust than lost it, 14% versus 11%, according to that Pew survey. And in fact, national rates of volunteerism have bounced up to levels that were seen prior to the pandemic.
Okay, now we're turning the calendar way back, and we end up with a poll that was done in 1939 by the Roper Survey, and it was a commission survey of youth. We're going to talk about that in a second. But what's interesting about this is they had a lot of people. We're going to talk about how they may have gotten these people way back in 1939. Different methodologies, certainly, than today. But they interviewed over 3,000 people, 3,157 people who were considered young people between the ages of 10 and 19. And the question asked was basically about iced tea and whether, to what degree, they like iced tea. Would you describe it as your favorite drink? One of the drinks you really like, something you will drink even though you aren't especially fond of it, or a drink you don't really like. And the most prominent answer here was one you drink because you really like it, 57%. Your favorite drink, 22%. Good news for iced tea companies back in those days. And then the remaining 20% aren't as thrilled with iced tea. But big footnote in this, the survey was commissioned by the Tea Bureau, who probably had some kind of vested interest in iced tea being a popular thing. So there's two things that
doesn't mean it's not legitimately done by the Roper organization.
No, not at all. Not at all. But they went to youth as a subgroup. But it's always important to talk about whether things are sponsored or not. Barb might want to tell us how they may have conducted this interview way back when.
What I find fascinating is that this was kind of a new application of survey research. We are talking to people about, all the things, they do in a day in their life. And gosh, we might be able to find out, whether there is interest in a particular product. And so the Tea Bureau, was really one of the first. And now it seems like very ironic. Like you actually mentioned, Lee, well, no, we now have to talk about who sponsored this. But then the idea was, well, we're kind of talking to these people about all sorts of things. Let's see if we can find out some information about our product. In this instance, their interest and like and favorability of tea and how often they drank it and all of those kinds of things. But this was unique in 1939.
So this is really early consumer research, basically?
Exactly. And this is a really good example of it. And it was done, by the Roper organization, and it was, considered a commercial survey as opposed to, a lot of the other public opinion surveys that they had been doing and that the other survey organizations at the time, like Gallup, had been doing as well. Now, it certainly wasn't new to think that this was something that could be applied to markets, but I think that it was very new to be looking at, segmenting the population and identifying, in this case, people ages 10 to 19, and finding out whether young people, thought there was, some interest in tea. And for the Tea Bureau, would there be a market for tea among young people? So, yeah, this is early marketing, Jay.
And do you like iced tea?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, Jay. I was going to, first of all, say that I am an iced tea guzzler, and I thought iced tea was a good way to not have sugar-filled Coca-Cola and Pepsi and other soft drinks.
Now in the South, though, the word iced tea means sweet tea.
Exactly.
So it has like twice the sugar of a Coke. So, you gotta...
I looked at I can drink unsweetened, which doesn't quite do it for me, or sweetened iced tea, which I then read the label has an enormous amount of sugar, way beyond what any reasonable person would want to drink. Were they just having a refreshing drink? Now I'd like to know. So I'm a guzzler. But I'm trying to break the habit now because I realize I'm just drinking colored sugar at that point. Jay, you raised the topic. Do you share this?
I'm not a big iced tea fan. I drink iced coffee, as everyone around here knows. I don't dislike it. It's just it's never been a go-to thing for me ever.
Mary, you're up. Iced tea. Yes, no.
Yes, I do enjoy iced tea. And I, in fact, enjoy it a little bit more when it's flavored with like a raspberry or something.
I'm sure
like
that's
that.
a result of some market testing as well. Barb, you spoke about the methods.
Well, I do enjoy an iced tea, especially a fresh brewed iced tea. I am not someone that will pick out a iced tea from a soda refrigerator. I will fresh brew it, hopefully with something that I've enjoyed along with Mary. I particularly like iced tea that has some kind of flavors to it, whether it's cinnamon or pumpkin or whatever is in season, and enjoy it without the sugar, I'm afraid, Lee.
AJ, are you a purist when it comes to iced tea, or do you contaminate it with all kinds of weird flavors like Barb and Mary do?
I do like iced tea plain, but I think we call it like an Arnold Palmer, so like lemonade and iced tea. That would be my favorite iced tea variant, I would say.
And Cassidy, you're going to get the last word on here. We're basically as in 1939, there's a lot of iced tea being drunk. You're an iced tea person?
I feel like I'm breaking hearts, but I don't like iced tea at all. I don't like the flavor. Yeah, I reluctantly drink it if I have a really sore throat, but I have to force myself to. So I guess I'm not a good last word for this.
I think you're only breaking the heart of the tea industry, so I don't think it's that bad.
Well, cheers for whatever you do drink, and we will have hopefully a pleasant week this week, and we'll catch up with you next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers, Cassie Connors, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.